Hey, folks, it seems like Isabel might be having some Wi-Fi issues right now, but thanks for coming and attending to Bridge, Michigan's election FAQ. This is a live discussion where we're going to be answering questions about the 2024 election. My name's Simon. I'm the Capital reporter here in Michigan. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit news outlet. I'm hopefully not going to be moderating today's discussion, but you've asked us some questions about voter rolls, campaign finance, and where political candidates stand on some of these key issues. I'm here along with Mike Wilkinson and Lauren Gibbons. We're going to be answering some of these questions. If you have any others, while we're going through some of these things, you can drop them in the chat, and we're going to do our best to go through them. You can also visit our website to see more of these election questions, and you can also see some of these answers and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of these FAQs as they come out on the day-to-day. So first of all, I think I should talk a little bit about, we're 2 weeks out from Election Day. It shows that, former President Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are essentially neck and neck in this state. And so I've been on the campaign trail looking at these things, and it's been a really interesting campaign up until now. We've seen these candidates from each of their respective campaigns working a little bit non-traditionally. Traditionally, in these presidential races, you see people making outreach and persuasive efforts to non-traditional bases far in advance of the election, and then the final few weeks going and trying to rally up their bases. But this past week, especially towards the end of the week, we saw Donald Trump in Detroit, sort of Michigan's Democratic stronghold, and Kamala Harris in Grand Rapids, which is more or less the seat of a more conservative West Michigan. And so they're making appeals, essentially looking to further expand their outreach for Kamala Harris. This is about Republicans, independents who can't stand Donald Trump, and they are maybe demotivated to voting. She's trying to show them that there's a place for them in her campaign. For Donald Trump, he's trying to talk about the economy, inflation issues, asking folks in communities like Detroit, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Highlighting inflation, the rising prices as examples of the failures of President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's administration. When you look at polls here, these candidates are essentially neck and neck. It's important not to look at individual polls, especially in the final 2 weeks into Election Day, but you can generally get a better sense of where the race is at by looking at some of these averages. And if you look at the average in, for instance, 538, these candidates are within 0.2% of each other in Michigan. But also there's a secret sauce here where these averages go. In Real Clear Politics, for example, they have Trump up 1.2 percentage points, which is a little bit better. But then at the same time, we have Kamala Harris up a little bit in the average from Nate Silver's Silver Bulletin poll average. So this is essentially a coin toss of a race at this point. And these closing arguments in Michigan are really going to matter a lot, especially as we see both of these candidates returning to the state over and over again.
Hey, Simon, I have a quick question. You've been all around the state, and when I look at the presidential visit map, I'm just shocked at how many dots are on the map. Does that tell us anything about how close it is in Michigan?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a battleground of battlegrounds. It's key for both of these candidates in terms of their own pathways to victory. And so if this wasn't such an integral state for both of these candidates, we wouldn't see them becoming nearly as much. And this is a huge change over just the past 8 years and to just how crucial this state is to winning the country.
How much is it costing local governments or the people who host these events in the first place?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's difficult to get an individual dollar figure for each of these visits just because there have been so many of them. But it can range from the thousands of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars. I think we can say with confidence that local governments in total have received costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars throughout the course of this because of the level of security and preparation that these local police forces have to go through to ensure the safety of these candidates. And it's not always the case necessarily that these campaigns are going to reimburse them. Sometimes local governments will send an invoice, and because campaigns can dissolve pretty quickly after an election, they may not always be reimbursed. Joe Biden's campaign, when he was the lead candidate, had a record of reimbursing some of these local government agencies, but it remains to be seen, I think, as the dust settles from this election season, what the total cost is something that I'm going to be interested in, what this is costing local police forces, and whether or not they're going to see some compensation for that.
Interesting. So there's going to be a lot more of this finance stuff that's not going to come out until after the election has passed.
Yeah, that's right, Isabel. And welcome back, by the way.
Thanks. I don't know what's going on with my internet, but we're going to keep rolling. So, Mike, you did a story last week. There are 8.4 million registered voters, which is nearly 500,000 more than the number of people in the state who are old enough to vote. What factors contribute to this imbalance?
Well, in 2018, the voters of Michigan decided they wanted to liberalize the voting rules and the registration rules. And at that point, if you sign up for a driver's license and you were old enough, or if you moved and went in for a change of address, there was a question on there. It said, well, there wasn't even a question. It said, you will be registered to vote unless you check this box to opt out. And what they believe happened, and the numbers kind of bear it out, is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who just hadn't typically registered were automatically registered. Now, is that 500,000? I mean, it seems almost fantastical that you could have more people registered than you have in the state who are old enough. But if those people then move to Indiana, Ohio, anywhere, when they moved, if they weren't interested in registering in the first place and they moved, there's no way that the state would have known that they were no longer on the voting rolls. And the other thing, and if they die, they will get a notification, and eventually they will be removed. The state has 600,000 people currently who are slated to be removed in 2025 and 2027, because once the state becomes aware that you probably don't live at the address where you're registered, they will put you on a watch list. And after you've not voted in 2 consecutive federal elections, they will remove you. So, they say the active voter list is 7.9 million, which is still a little bit above the voting age population, but it's not that 500,000. But it is a big number, and it's caused a lot of contention. The Republican National Committee has sued the state again back in March, saying you need to clean up the rolls. They did not allege fraud. What they alleged was that it costs them time and money to have to make sure the elections are secure because there's so many people on the rolls, and it costs them money and time because when they're trying to actually run a campaign, they might run into people who are not registered. And so if you're going down a block and you have a limited amount of time to get your message out, and you go to stop at 2 of the 20 doors that aren't really registered, you're wasting your time. So that was their point. But there have not been cases of widespread voter fraud because of the bloated rolls. And lots of people call them bloated, including the former state director of elections, Chris Thomas.
So, what safeguards exist so that we can ensure that our elections are free and fair given these bloated voter rolls?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So one of the big protections is that to determine whether a voter is actually the person that is voting, there's a signature requirement. And so if a clerk or a local election official doesn't think a signature matches up, if they believe that someone is trying to falsify or impersonate a voter, they can go in, they can flag it, and they can require that person to come in or otherwise verify their identity before that vote is counted. So that's one big area where that it kind of protects against this. It's also just pretty hard to commit fraud in Michigan, and when things happen, such as the instance in St. Clair Shores recently, where there were a few people who were found to have tried to double vote. That was quickly caught by election officials. It was forwarded on to law enforcement and authorities. So while there are instances of attempts of fraud, it's very rare. And the other unique thing about Michigan that contributes to this and makes it very difficult to falsify or otherwise interfere with elections is just because our system is so localized. Each individual municipality has control over its own elections. So you would have to interfere with every township and city around the state to have any major widespread impact, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And we actually had a reader question that wanted to know about those voters who are alleged to have double voted. Will they be allowed to vote in the November election?
Yes, so they actually can. Innocent until proven guilty here. If you have committed felony, if you're in jail, you're not allowed to vote from prison. But if you've been charged with something, that process is still ongoing. So they could technically still vote, but they cannot vote twice.
Which is the whole reason they are in trouble in the first place, right? So
Well,
some
yeah.
voters Some voters have already made up their minds. We have more than 1 million Michigan voters as of this morning have already submitted their ballots, whether that's absentee or early. What does this mean for the election?
Well, it means a lot of people have already have made up your mind, as you pointed out. In 2020, we had 5.5 million people vote. It was the most ever. So we're approaching 20% of that number right now. And I'm sure by tomorrow, it will be 20%. There's a lot of interest here. A lot of people think, oh, this is going to benefit Democrats over Republicans. They're more likely to vote absentee. Well, that trend has changed a little bit. Republicans have, looking at numbers from individual counties and municipalities, Republicans are more likely now to vote absentee, not in the same numbers, but if they vote absentee or they vote early or they vote on election day, it's all the same. It's all whether or not their vote is cast in one way or another. So I don't think we can look at that million and say, oh my gosh, the Democrats have such a lead. It just means a lot of people are really interested in this election, as we would have suspected.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really changed from 2020 in terms of the messaging we're seeing around absentee voting is that Republicans are now encouraging it. They really want to see these votes banked early, in part because it's advantageous for both of these parties to have their key supporters, their core base, voting early, because they can then look at the data from the state and see, oh, these people have already cast their absentee ballots. We don't need to go harassing them via text message, phone call, mail, knocking on their doors. We can then spend our money on the people who we think will vote for us, but maybe haven't engaged in voting yet. And so it's a question of resources for these folks. But while Democrats have really pushed, all forms of voting for many years now, Republicans, this is something of a pivot for them. And so it remains to be seen. And I think one of the big narrative takeaways from this election is how successful they were, both in encouraging absentee voting and sort of outsourcing their Get Out the Vote program to some of these outside groups like the Elon Musk funded America PAC, for instance, and whether that can bring them success. And so that's something that I'm going to be really interested to track.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just realize, both parties of both stripes, God, it's a heck of a lot easier to fill out your ballot, right? At home and then mail it in if you trust the mail, or take it to the drop box. There's some states that have been doing this for years. And I think people are going, wow, that would, they got my vote. And I'm going to cast it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Simon, Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, recently made some news explaining when she thinks we will have the full results. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So she talked about, she's on Face the Nation on Sunday, and she said that she's hoping that we'll have full complete statewide, I should say, unofficial election results by the end of the day on Wednesday after the election. So that's November 6th. And that's pretty fast, I would say, relative to some of these past elections. And that's in part because of election law changes that's going to allow some of these local clerks to pre-process absentee ballots. And also, of course, including the early voting options, early in-person voting. Your votes aren't necessarily totaled up ahead of the election, but they are run through a tabulator. And so that means that these votes are already in the tabulator, that they're ready to be counted once polls close on election day. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether we can have this happen as quickly as folks would like. But certainly there's been a number of things that election administrators have said they like to make some of the process of the vote count smoother.
And Simon, can you just explain for the readers when we say they can start counting the absentees earlier, what happened in 2020? When could they actually start counting them?
Yeah, so absentee voting they could only do very limited pre-processing ahead of the election. It wasn't sort of the full suite that was then brought into availability as part of 2022's Proposal 2, I believe. Now they can sort of take the ballots out of the envelope, leave them in the secrecy sleeve, get them ready to run through the tabulator up to 8 days ahead of the election. And so as a result, it makes things a lot easier for some of these administrators, especially in areas where there's a large populations like Detroit. We're not going to see, like we did in 2020, these absentee vote counting boards that are working for hours and hours through the night, hopefully, counting these votes after Election Day.
And we're going to, of course, have updates on all of this at our elections tracker, on our website, et cetera. One of the things we are charged as doing as journalists is reporting the facts, but we know people can interpret those facts differently and use it to confirm their own worldviews. We had a reader who asked, what steps is the media taking to ensure that its reporting does not enable or cause conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think all journalists bridge, but other news organizations are also taking this very seriously as well. We saw in 2020 just so many theories about Michigan elections as well as other swing states really run rampant for months and even years after the election happened. So what we tried to do then and what we will continue to try to do in this election cycle is, explore where the theories are coming from, who's originating them, look into it as best we can, try to follow the facts where they lead, and then make sure that readers are aware of the situation. Now, part of that also includes discerning whether an individual theory rises to the level of investigating and reporting it out. Certainly some of them we don't necessarily want to elevate if it is something that is, blatantly incorrect or something that could proliferate as the question suggested. So we really try to be very discerning about everything that comes our way. Really, our main goal is just to make sure that our readers know as much as they can about the election. That's part of the reason we do our FAQ series. If questions come up, if situations happen where there are questions, there are investigations that need to be done, we will continue to do those.
Yeah, and I would add that I think some of this burden does lie upon the actual reader to do their own digging, because sometimes, there was a real recent case where, like, where'd that come from? And then you find out that the only outlet that wrote about it was a UK publication writing about Southern Ohio, some incident in Southern Ohio, and it got amplified. It wasn't the Columbus Dispatch, it wasn't the Cincinnati Enquirer. And I think you have to ask yourself, if you're the reader, where did this come from? And kind of dive down and see, because we might not even write a story because it's not true, but that doesn't mean it's not a story somewhere. And so some of the burden is upon the reader to kick the tires themselves.
One example of the work that we're doing on this is the reason we want to know your questions is it helps us understand what are you seeing on the campaign trail, what are YouTube ads are you using, what questions do you have about the election. So that's why we're excited to do this work. We had a reader who wants to know where they can find nonpartisan voter information. Simon, what do you recommend?
Yeah, so obviously Bridge would be the first thing that I'd recommend. Of course, I'm biased towards our own series of frequently asked questions. We provided FAQ written articles approaching some of these more complicated or nuanced answers that we have to provide. And then we also, you can look at some of these third-party sources, like, for example, the League of Women Voters provides a website called vote411.org, which provides candidates questionnaires. It's a standardized form, and then they're allowed to, from presidential candidates down to the local level, answer these questions. But, of course, the pitfall there is that not all these candidates are filling out these questionnaires necessarily. Another example would be, you can also look at other news sources. I think it's important, as Mike was saying, when you verify, when you're looking to verify local news sources, you want to make sure that you're looking at reporters who are actually existing in your communities, that these are not just some a URL that happens to have your city or town's name in it, but that when you're looking for voter information, that this is long established local news sources that you can trust.
Along with that, we've had several reader questions in the last few weeks about the basics of voting. What ID do you need? What checks and balances exist? Simon, can you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, broadly speaking, you need a photo ID in order to vote on election day. That means a driver's license, state ID card, a federal, state, local, or government issued photo ID. You can use your passport, military, student, tribal, or even a concealed pistol license. All these things are considered legal photo identification for the purposes of voting on election day. Even if you don't have a voter ID, you're able to sign an affidavit of voter without photo identification. And this is where some people take issue with this. People who are skeptical about the legitimacy of our election say that this isn't good enough. And what election officials turn to in this regard is that if you sign this and you lie, and that you're not a U.S. citizen who is, eligible to register and vote on election day, that you're committing perjury and that this is against the law. And that then they're going to, provide post-election audits, hopefully, and catch these individuals. That's generally the main form. And I know that we had a question about whether or not undocumented immigrants can use a driver's license to register to vote or use a driver's license to cast a ballot on election day. And the answer there is simply no. And that's in large part because undocumented immigrants in the state of Michigan cannot get driver's license. This has actually been an issue that immigration advocates had for some time, but as it stands, it's just simply not possible.
Right, and we'll include more information in the chat with our previous coverage on this question. We also had a reader who wanted to know about what candidates are saying about abortion. They specifically asked about U.S. Senate candidates Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin, and then the congressional race between Tom Barrett and Curtis Hertel.
Yeah, I'll speak more broadly to this because this is a common theme up and down the ticket, regardless of who is running. But I can also get to those specific candidates as well. Generally speaking, Democrats have really been pushing hard on Republicans' record on abortion, following up on obviously the 2022 ballot initiative to codify abortion rights in Michigan state constitution following the overturning of Roe versus Wade federal abortion protections. So that has been a very common theme from Democrats across the campaign trail, questioning anti-abortion records of, for example, Mike Rogers, Tom Barrett, etc. Republicans have kind of evolved their position on abortion, certainly in Mike Rogers' case. He has said, regardless of his personal views, he will, let the state decide, let Michigan's ruling stand on abortion. He's also highlighted, his support of IVF. It actually was a very contentious moment in the most recent U.S. Senate debate between him and Alyssa Slotkin, and Slotkin was questioning his sincerity on some of these positions. So that's been a common theme. Republicans are having to defend their positions on abortion, and a lot of them have been saying, we heard what voters had to say. We'll let the state opinion stand. But at those federal level, if there were to be, for whatever reason, a federal vote on an abortion ban, that is where Democrats are saying, how serious is their commitment to the 2022 initiative?
For sure. And our colleague Jordan Hermany wrote a story just a few weeks ago talking about how the two parties have changed how they talk about abortion since the fall of Roe. And so I think that's a really interesting place to look if you're looking for specific candidates' positions on abortions. We also, as we've mentioned many times over this call, have all of our previous FAQ shows on our website. Our YouTube channel also has that. And then we have written stories as well for some of the most common questions we're getting, or those questions where there's a little bit more of a complicated, we can't put it into a 30-second soundbite. So we want to direct you to there as well. Thank you all for bearing so much with me and my internet issues today. We've also talked about voter IDs. We've talked about bloated voter rolls. We've talked about candidates' positions on abortion. We've talked about how Michigan is still a place where presidential candidates are visiting all the time. And we've also talked about how to find the most accurate and informative poll information you can find. If you have more questions for our reporters, you can go to our website, bridgemi.com, where we'll answer more questions next week. Thank you so much for spending part of your morning with us, and we'll be back next week.